but my association with the C Center extends much longer than this time, since I began my journey at Corbel as a C Fellow almost 5 years ago. And through these 5 years, one of the biggest highlights has been working with the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative for 5 years now, and learning how to bridge academic research with the work of frontline activists, human rights defenders, and feminist movements all over the world. So the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative is a program at the C Center which aims to elevate and amplify the work that women identified activists are doing at the grassroots level to promote peace, justice, and human rights around the world. So IGLI, as we call it, has three components. One, convenings, such as our flagship Summer Institute, of which I've been to three, and they've all been marvelous. And this year, we sort of branched out into three regional institutes. The second component is a research program in which we explore women's rights after war. And third, a curricular and community program, which brings incredibly amazing frontline activists to Denver to share their knowledge and experience with our students at the Corbel School and all of you who are here in the audience today. Carolina Barrero is our fifth practitioner in residence as part of this program. She joins remarkable women like Farida Naburema, Nanjala Naibola, Hani Al Sayed, and Shoman Hadi, who some of you may remember from our last event in January this past year. And they come from places like Togo, Kenya, Syria, and Iraq to share their wisdom and experiences with our community. I'd also like to flag that we will be launching a certificate in global justice at the Corbel School this fall, which will help to support more courses and programming featuring the work of these activists, with the goal of helping students at the Corbel School, like myself, learn concrete strategies for building a more just world. Today's event will feature a keynote lecture by Carolina Barrero, and will be followed by a fireside chat between her and Professor Mary Berry, who is the convener of IGLI and director of the Si Shukang Center of International Security and Diplomacy. We will then open the floor to questions from you all. So to give you a bit more about Carolina. Carolina Barrero is a Cuban human rights activist advocate and democracy activist for the end of violence and authoritarianism, for peace and respect of civil and political rights. Tonight, we will hear how she took part in the protest movement that challenged Cuba's totalitarian regime in 2021 as a member of 27N and the San Isidro movement. She was consequently detained, prosecuted, and arrested until she was finally forced into exile in February 2022. She's been invited as a speaker in events such as the Oslo Freedom Forum, College Freedom Forum, Human Rights Watch, Annual Council, and the World Liberty Congress. From exile, she continues to advocate for freedom in Cuba and to support activists inside the island. Please join me in welcoming Carolina to the stage to be with us tonight.
Thank you to the Corbel School of International Studies and the CS Center for hosting this event. Thank you to Mari Berry for the invitation to visit the University of Denver this spring. Thank you to Shannon and Gergana for planning and the dedicated efforts ensuring my visit. Allow me to begin by telling you a personal story I haven't yet shared in public. During my time in house arrest in Havana, a state security agent known as Mario came to see me. At that time, I was constantly monitored by guards outside my house 24 hours. 4 police officers, a state security agent, and the military forces known as Boinas Rojas. All my communications were intervened. They listened and watched almost every single one of my steps. I was listening now in silence to Mario and what he came to say. He expressed his concerns about the longest house arrest, how the inconvenience for the neighborhood's peace, the amount of resources it was taken to them for keeping me locked, and then he made a proposal. He said, if you agree to go quiet, I will end this house arrest now. I immediately answered. I said, Mario, you can come in 3 days, you can come in 3 years, my answer will be the same. Mi compromiso es con la verdad y con la justicia. Punto. My commitment is to truth and justice, period. The police patrol, the house arrest, the justification of all of the arbitrary procedures is your problem, not mine. I have never felt freer. Under a regime with no respect for justice, rebellion becomes the law. I have thought a lot about this moment afterwards, especially about those two words, truth and justice, and their significance to the protest movement I took part during the year 2021. The Cuban regime stands as the longest-running power in the Western Hemisphere, with a history of 64 years marked by oppression, assassination, incarcerations, and forced exiles of those who hold different opinions from the official narrative. This totalitarian regime, dominated by a military elite and the Castro family, has maintained an iron grip on power, allowing only one political party, the Communist Party, to rule surpassing the bounds of law and justice. It is a nation subjugated by an elite where justice is itself imprisoned, subjected to the whims and the directive of the Communist Party. Yet the most pervasive and enduring aspect of this regime has been the incessant dissemination of lies. The narrative of the revolution, with its captivating tale of the guerrilla fighters rising to power in the pursuit of social justice, served as a myth that ensured the establishment of the Cuban regime in the eyes of international opinion. This myth became the tool employed by the state security's propaganda machinery to cultivate the acceptance and normalization of the dictatorship. However, it is essential to recognize that this narrative is merely a mirage, a facade that conceals the harsh reality and atrocities that lie behind the polished image presented to those who dare not to look beyond its surface. If there is a group within society that possesses a deep understanding of the potency of image, the persuasive force of myths, and the art of storytelling, it is the artists, writers, the philosophers, the playwrights. They understand the power of images, the components of narratives in stories, and because of it, they are more likely to uncover them, to crack them, and eventually to overcome them. In the spring of 2018, following the appointment of Miguel Díaz-Canel as Raúl Castro's successor, a group of artists took a bold step by utilizing performative intervention in public spaces. Significant was the one made by a young artist, Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, and art historian Yanelis Núñez, both in the image behind me. They spread human excrement all over their bodies in front of the Capitolio, which is the seat of the National Assembly. The protest, half art, half activism, was uploaded to social media, and it is spread like gunpowder. Though their artistic expression, artists aim to symbolize and expose the corruption and decay of the regime. These acts serve as a powerful visual statements, capturing the attention of both the public and the authorities. By challenging the status quo and defying the limitations imposed on creative expression, these artists courageously shed light on the lies of a regime, sparking thought within society. In retrospect, the events of that period signaled the dawn of a new era, wherein citizens came to realize that the potential for anti-governmental protest was not merely an abstract aspiration or a dream, but a tangible reality. The actions taken by the artists and activists demonstrated that dissent and opposition to the government had the power to ignite significant change. This awakening among the populace marked a shift in collective consciousness as people began to recognize their own agency and the potential impact of their voices and actions. From those courageous acts, the Movimiento San Isidro was born in September 2018, followed by the emergence of Group 27N 2 years later. The night of November 27th, which became the namesake for the later group, witnessed an unprecedented display of public protest. Hundreds of individuals gathered in front of the Ministry of Culture, voicing their hands for an end to political violence, the recognition of civil and political rights, and the promotion of pluralism within society. This remarkable demonstration stands as one of the largest protests ever recorded in front of a governmental building. Notably, during this significant event, people utilized their mobile phones to illuminate the darkness of the night. They share and upload images, harnessing the power of social media to disseminate the contagious feeling of freedom that ignited a flame for protests to come. On January 27, 2021, a smaller group gathered at the Ministry of Culture for another protest. Despite its modest size, the impact of this demonstration deepened the collective awareness. Within mere 30 minutes of our arrival, the area was swiftly surrounded by police and state security forces, effectively preventing the possibility of a largest protest from taking place. The tension and sense of forthcoming violence was very tangible, but we decided to respond in a different manner. In the face of this escalating situation, we chose to read a poem titled Dos Patrias by José Martí. Almost if the poem, it could be a spell that could cast truth, peace, and reconciliation. It was our shield against the violence. In the poem, you can read the first two verses, Dos patrias tengo yo, Cuba y la noche, o son una las dos. Two homelands I have, Cuba and the night, or they are one and only one. The year 2021 witnessed a cascade of protests that swept through the nation. One after the other, these protests emerged, eventually culminating in a transformative citizens' uprising during the summer. The initial spark ignited by artists in the spring of 2018 was merely a precursor to the monumental event that unfolded thereafter. The citizens themselves emerged as the true protagonists of this movement, as hundreds of thousands took to the street, united in their call for freedom. The magnitude and scale of these demonstrations were unprecedented, reflecting the deep-rooted desire for change and the collective yearning for a society built on principles of liberty and justice. The people, driven by their unwavering determination, fearlessly voiced their demands, refusing to be silenced any longer. This uprising marked a turning point as the movement transitioned from an artistic and intellectual endeavor to a mass mobilization of citizens from all walks of life. It demonstrated the power of unity and solidarity as individuals from diverse backgrounds joined forces, transcending differences and standing shoulder to shoulder in the pursuit of freedom. The subsequent repression following the uprising has resulted in Cuba having the highest number of political prisoners in the Americas, exceeding 1,066 individuals according to a recent report by prisoners' defenders. It has also led to the largest exodus in the country's history, with activists forced into exile and a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance and control over any form of political dissent. Merely posting a message on Facebook can lead you to being targeted and detained in Villa Marista, a notorious center of investigation infamous for its use of white torture techniques. However, despite these repressive measures, the protest movement in Cuba continues to persist. Every day, there remains a possibility for protests to occur, demonstrating the enduring spirit of the resistance. Just 10 days ago, a significant protest unfolded in Caimanera, a small town in the far east of the country. The images captured during this event depicts a multitude of people marching towards the municipal communist government as they shouted "Libertad, vivan los derechos humanos, and viva Cuba libre." This powerful display was unwavering demonstration served as a poignant reminder that the desire for freedom and the fight for human rights continues. Every day, the regime loses credibility. Every day, the democratic forces gain strength. Truth and justice will be the guidance for our potential transition as the threads holding the regime together begin to unravel. The hues of freedom burst forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm so moved. I think you mentioned that the poem served as a shield to the work that all the protesters were doing. And that just landed with me in a way that I thought was incredibly moving. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being here with us today. This is a real honor and a privilege for all of us here in Denver and at the Corbell School. You started your story to us today by talking about a time that you were in house arrest. And I know a little bit about your background as an art historian, as someone who's had a really rich and interesting kind of career in the arts. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about what triggered your activism that would then lead to you being in a context of house arrest.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Actually, many people ask me that oftenly. I have many different answers for that, and as I have deepened my own reflection on how actually made me turn to activism, I am more sure it was the way I was, my background, the way I was raised in my family. I was raised by my grandparents, and they were both from Bayamo. I think there is someone here from Cuba. Bayamo is in the far east of the country and was the place where Independence War started. So I grew up listening to stories of the war and freedom and everything that the Mambises, this army that fight against the Spanish colonialism did. Amazing stories of how they burn a whole town actually before they allow the Spaniards to gain the town back. And they lose everything before being submitted again. And those stories were part of my childhood. I was always very critical with the regime at school, but never did protest in public spaces, which is another step you take. And I did it inspired by the acts of Movimiento San Isidro, of friends like Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara. They started putting a step out. They started going from galleries, the safe spaces of galleries. Well, are never safe in a country like Cuba, but fairly safe spaces of galleries or studios to go to the streets and protest and show that the protest was a possibility for all of us. And I was very much inspired by that. We came from studying together, from discussing all of these ideas in a moment previously to all of this, around 2009, 2014, while we were in college. Sometimes my house became a place for all of those discussions, like a tertulia kind of place. And that was a ferment for everything that happened afterwards, and that made me also take a step in and not just being critical, but going to the streets and protesting.
So as you began to work with activists, you see a change in some ways in the political environment in Cuba, especially over the past few years. And you really, I think, emphasize that there's always been this tremendous repression, but there was really an amplification of some of this in the last few years. Can you tell us a little bit about what sort of work you were doing and what sort of work other activists were doing that then led eventually to that detention?
Well, resistance is important to begin by saying resistance to authoritarian regime in Cuba started as long as the 1st of January 1959, right? This is not new. We didn't, we're not doing this for the first time. Actually, it was so hard in the 60s that thousands of people, we don't know yet how many, were sentenced to death, fueron fusilados without trial, at the command of El Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, without any access to justice, just sentenced to death. That is the story we still need. That is part of the truth we need to find and seek. Also in the 70s, we have the UMAP. This was like gulags, basically, concentration camps for everyone that that his or her appearance looked like could be different from the hombre nuevo, the new man that the Communist Party was trying to, and this is in the 70s, concentration camps. So there is a whole story of resistance we need to honor, especially young generations. But it is also true that this comes with cycles of protest, it comes and goes. And at least this last cycle of protest, which I referred in my words, I think we can trace it. It started in 2018. It was a moment right after what it appeared to be in Cuba, an openness. After the Obama visit, many of you remember. So there was a sense that change was possible, but then very suddenly, that changed back. And Raúl Castro's policy was to actually close the island, and he appointed, because we haven't had free and fair elections in Cuba for a very long time, 1948 was the last time, he appointed Raúl. That's why I think it's not even wise to call him president. No one voted for him. In any case, you can say an appointed president. And their policy was to actually, the first law approved by him was Decree 349, and it was a decree to limit the freedom of expression and creativeness of artists, because artists started to become kind of rebels. And that sparked many of those seminal protests in the artistic movement that then spread. In a country like Cuba, just to read a poem like this in the street, in the public plaza, in front of the Ministry of Culture, for them it's a crime, and actually it threats them And you could say, but what can a poem harm, right? Why are they so afraid of a girl reading a poem, or 20 people maybe reading it out loud? It's just a poem. And I would like to actually answer what you said before. Poetry has the possibility to cast light. The metaphor has the potential to actually let us see reality in a new light, in a new form that lenguaje llano, plain language, cannot. It changes. It is actually sometimes a kind of a spell that breaks mirages or myths. Comes with a deepened truth that only in the language of poetry can be said. And to face that was to face the policemen and to confront that reality that they try to, and that truth they try to remain unclose. But we use it actually, as I said, as a shield, because it was a moment where all the street was full with police and military, and we knew that at any moment something and that actually happened, they could come and crack down the protests with violence. Actually, in the case of that protest, the Ministry of Culture himself stood out of the building to the street and gave a punch to a young journalist that was actually forecasting the whole protest. The Ministry of Culture himself. And then the police. Can you imagine if a ministry of, a high officer of the government, punch an activist in the middle of the street? He's still the Ministry of Culture. And that tells you everything about the nature of the regime.
Take us to what it felt like at that moment. What was it for you personally? Who were the people around you? What did it feel like every single day? And I'm curious to know whether there was some real hope at the moment that perhaps the protests could make a change. Do you feel like there was that hope, or did it always feel very futile?
No, definitely. Everything has been worth it. Everything. When you are in a protest like that, you are not really thinking too much. You actually act by instinct. And you take decisions based on how to expose the regime, how to maintain peace, if that's possible, and also how to endure violence, because that is actually the most impactful thing you can do. So I think Cuba is now in a moment, in a turning point. People thought that maybe after the crackdown of the summer of 2021 protests, the regime would succeed in suffocating the resistance movement. However, as I said before, Cuba is a country in the Americas with more political prisoners. It is also the country that has faced the largest exodus. It's been the largest exodus in Cuban history, and we have had quite a few. This one has been the largest. And the control now of the population, the surveillance is total. However, that image, this is 10 days ago. Protest is pretty much alive, much more than in Nicaragua or Venezuela, which is something none of us could have thought, because we come from 60 years of authoritarianism, but it is pretty much there. The relations between the exiles communities and the activists inside Cuba has also become more, has strengthened. We actually did a campaign 2 months ago to make people aware that if they didn't go to vote in the ratification process of the Communist Party, that would be a gesture of resistance as well. We call it empty streets. July 11th, we show full streets to express the rejection to the regime. Now we will do empty streets. We will stay home. And it was like that. In Cuba, you queue for everything. because there is no food, there is no anything. So every time Cubans are very much, they know how to do a good queue. But for electoral college, for that date to vote and ratify the deputies of the National Communist Assembly, no one was there. And it was also a form of a silent protest. And we did that with the activists inside and with the ones that are in exile, and it was a huge success. And it was also a proof that there are more things that unite us than separate us. So I think I think there is a potential transition. I think everything can happen any moment. No one could imagine on July the 10th that something like July 11th would happen next day. Literally no one. Not even the people that went to the street the first in San Antonio de los Baños, because the protest started by 20 people going out and doing a Facebook Live video, and that sparked a chain reaction all over the island that led to hundreds of thousands of people in the street. No one, not even them, could imagine that that would happen. No one could imagine that in Caimanera, this is the closest town to the La Base Naval de Guantánamo, the United States base in Cuba. So it is very militarized, it's under great surveillance. The protest had nothing to do with the United States military base. No one was saying he wanted to cross. No, it was about freedom. But this was the last town, any of us would imagine that something like this would happen. And it was hundreds of people, and they shouted, "Libertad, vivan los derechos humanos," which I think is pretty straightforward. They were not just saying we are hungry, lift the embargo. No, they were saying freedom, vivan los derechos humanos, and abajo la dictadura. So that's pretty much straightforward for a protest, so no one gets confused about the real motives of it.
Absolutely. I think it's very compelling. I met Carolina last summer here in Denver when she was one of about 15 women activists from all across the globe that attended the Summer Institute that's part of our Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative. And I had a chance to kind of learn about the fierceness of this struggle and of this determination, and ultimately the deep creativity as well that's been required to sustain the work that you've been doing. I know, if I can share with everyone, that you were forced into exile. And for the last year, you've lived outside of Cuba. Last year and several months, you've lived outside of Cuba. Can you take us through what that has been like for you, and what it's been like to begin to do this work, not as somebody living within the country on the island, but actually as somebody abroad, as somebody trying to think strategically and creatively about how we do advance freedom in Cuba in the long run?
I will start by explaining how I was forced into exile, because maybe you are thinking, oh, did they put a gun in my head? Did they just took me to the plane by force? Well, sort of. They didn't put a gun, and they didn't put rocks on me and put me on a plane, but they threatened me with other people, especially with mothers of political prisoners that were protesting with me. I organized with them a protest in front of one of the courts where the trials of July 11th were happening. Actually, that day, they were judging 33 people. 9 of them were minors of age at that moment. And I was with their mothers protesting outside. They stopped the protest with violence. They took all of us to prison. I was taken to a different prison, and the state police agent came to see me, and I was in prison. I was not in my house arrest, it was in calabozo. And he said, Carolina, you have 48 hours to leave the country. If you don't go, we will prosecute 12 of the mothers you were protesting with, he gave me a list for public disorder, as if public disorder can be, as it's that, the love of a mother can be called public disorder. It is for public disorder for them, apparently. Your friend and activist Daniela Rojo will wait for trial in jail because she has already an accusation for her participation in July 11th protest. Your friend Michael Castillo, who is one of the singers and composers of the song Patria Vida that maybe some of you have heard, will not receive medical attention in prison, and his request for a humanitarian visa will not be attended. If you go, we are not saying we will give it to him, but it will not be attended. Definitely, he will not receive medical. And then they continue. Your best friend, which is a teacher actually at a university like this one, we will expel her from university. She will not be ever, for her, she will not be possible to teach anymore inside Cuba. So that is not a decision to make. When you care about yourself, it's your own responsibility is fine. You can choose whatever you want. But when other people and the safety and the security of those people, you don't have a choice. So it was not a gun, but sort of. So I've been since then in exile. I am in Madrid, which is a place I know. It's not I went to Madrid to study some years ago. Actually, I hold a Spanish passport, so it hasn't been as traumatic as it is for other people. But of course, the place I want to be is inside Cuba. However, there is so much to do in exile. It's just another narrative of the Cuban regime to make you feel that if you go to exile, you're out of the game, you cannot do anything else. Actually, if you know the history of Cuba and many other countries, many things started in exile. In the case of Cuba, for example, the revolution itself, because Fidel Castro came in a yacht after being exiled, or the independence war, José Martí, actually the author of the poem I was reading, spent most of his life in exile, and he prepared the war there. He funded the Partido Revolucionario abroad, and all the war of 1995 that ended the colonialism in Cuba was prepared from abroad. And now I think activists are beginning to understand that inside and outside Cuba, and the strategies they can do together. To be here talking to you, to amplify the message, is part of our fight too. So I have tried to use this month to contribute and to amplify the voices of the ones inside that
cannot be here with us today. 2019, people have said, was the year on record with the most protests in the most places across the globe. More people participated in protest movements in 2019, by some counts, than at any other time in modern history or recorded history. In some ways, I think this reflects a growing intolerance and recognition with the lack of freedoms that so many people live with in their lives today. I'm wondering, for you personally, Carolina, how has working in community with activists from other parts of the globe, from outside of Cuba, meant? What has that meant for your own work, and what have you learned from these other struggles that people have been fighting in different parts of the globe?
I have learned basically that we all are facing the same challenges. It's been amazing to meet activist women from Iran, for example, Masih Alinejad, that actually lives here in the States, great activist, and listening to her saying, oh, we have so much problem with opposition unity. What's going on, Masih? And she's telling me exactly the same arguments that we Cubans have been facing for 60 years. And then you talk to a Venezuelan activist, and it is the same. A Nicaraguan activist, and it is the same. When I talk to Cuban activists about this, we usually say, oh, it's because we are Cubans, and then it's because we are Latin Americans, and it's because we don't agree on anything, we are not mature enough, we have these problems. But then is Iran, and you talk to Russian activists, and it is worse. And, China activists, it's all over the world. And then you start to understand, this might be, there might be some other things. Obviously, possibly, and yes, there are many problems of, solidarity, maybe not mature enough movements, but also there is an element of design that it's introduced there by the regimes themselves, because they have learned how to create this trust, because it's the same patterns everywhere. And by sharing this experience with activists, you start thinking globally. Also, we live in a different world now than the 20th century. We live in a world of an alliance of autocrats. I mean, you cannot just, if you talk about Putin, you have to understand that the allies of Putin in Latin America are Raúl Castro, Maduro, y Ortega. Lavrov, which is the foreign minister of Russia, was visiting these three countries a month ago. So it's not just that, oh yes, they are autocratic. No, they are autocratic regimes working together. It's an alliance, a network of autocrats. So we activists have come to realize that if they work together, so must we. If they strategize together, if they share military information, surveillance information, we also must share strategies on how to bring them down. And it is better if we can think also regionally and globally. We are not as much alone. There is a lot of strength and muscle when you create these kinds of alliance. And that is part of what I have learned this year as well.
I think that's beautiful that if the autocrats are working together, and they certainly are, that those of us on the side of freedom and justice have to be doubling down and working together and finding ways also to overcome the fact that so often the fracturing of these movements for change happens within the movements, but it's caused so often by these regimes through misinformation, through these campaigns, sowing the seeds of distrust, right? These ways in which it's so easy to kind of cause a movement to fracture and to then fizzle. I want to know where art fits into the solution here in your experience. It seems to me that there's something profoundly powerful and sometimes very universal about the experience of being able to see poetry, to be able to see art, to be able to create in community with other people. Where do you see this, the arts and artists making a meaningful impact in trying to challenge those autocratic tendencies and networks?
They do, and that is why autocrats fear artists so much, why they repress them. But they're only part of it, right? The citizens and the voice of the citizens, that is what needs to be heard. And artists are part of that process and part of that bigger picture. I think the most important thing that artists do, and as I said, writers, playwrights, even philosophers, is to understand the narratives and myths that all of these regimes they have. Because what actually sustains a regime, even beyond military forces, state security, is the power of the story that holds them, which is made of lies, which is a mirage, which is something that distracts the audience from the true violations of human rights happening behind. And what artists can do is that they can create cracks on those mirage because they understand the power of a storytelling the narratives behind it, and can actually propose artifacts, art, right, that can actually unravel that spell. And I think that's why they are so dangerous for and feared by dictators.
I think that's beautifully put. Is there an artist or a medium or a performance that you can point us to that has lifted your spirits or created some sort of generative feeling inside you?
Poetry,
Yeah.
poetry. That's been for me.
Thank you. I want to ask Carolina just one more question. So begin thinking about what you would like to ask her. And we'll have a chance to really kind of have a dialogue with her. The question that I want to ask her is, where do we go next? And specifically in terms of the context in Cuba, what is the next step for the movement that opposes the regime? What is your role? And perhaps what can those of us in the audience that are interested in knowing more, learning more, do to be a part of that next step?
It is a very diverse movement. I don't have not the first, not the last voice about it, but one thing we all share is we need to maintain pressure. We need to establish more links, more solidarity. We need to strategize together. We need to expose more the regime. This is not an opinion, it is a fact. The Cuban regime has never been as weak as it is right now, for many reasons. One of them, of course, is the protest movement, which is still very much alive despite the repression. The other one is that the credibility of the Díaz-Canel appointed government and Raúl Castro's regime is very fragile. It's very difficult to sustain an argument that defends them, especially in the light of everything that happened after July 11th. They have no credibility in front of international opinion and no credibility inside Cuba. After the ratification process, the elections that happened on March 26, almost no other country congratulated Díaz-Canel as appointed president, except I think Bolivia, Venezuela, of course, the usual suspects, but not even among them he received too many. And I think it was the first time that something like that happened. And that what that means is lack of recognition by international community. They are pretty much alone, only with Russia and Venezuela. And that's good news. It is good news for Cuban people because in the path for freedom to expose autocrats and not to normalize a dictatorship is very helpful, especially for the democratic forces. So for us is to push, keep pushing as much as we can. Solidarity is also very important. If a group and I will explain it. If a group inside Cuba does an action, the rest should support. It doesn't matter if there are differences about, I don't know, whatever. That doesn't matter. We are all fighting for freedom, so we should, stand for each other's safety and support. This is very important. That's why in Poland, Solidaridad was a name given by Walesa to the movement of workers and those sindicatos. And it has actually been it has played a key role in all of the protests. All of the protests that I show and more, because these were just examples, were sparked by solidarity. So that is also part of the solution.
I think that is at the core of what we've been trying to build at the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative here at the Corbell School, is a real, how do we help to create a container for the deepening of solidarity between activists from different contexts that may at the surface level think the work that they're doing is different, but actually we spend a little time together and we realize that we're all fighting the same battles, different stakes, different contexts, and oftentimes different material circumstances, but the underlying root systems that are harming so many people in the world today are shared. Thank you, Carolina.
Thank you.
I want to open up a chance to all of you to ask some questions. Yes, I love that. And Gergana, thank you, will be coming around with a microphone. So go ahead and just raise your hand up and she'll come over and find you. Thanks.
Gracias, Carolina. Would you tell us a little bit more about the role of social media and the role that it played in disseminating the protest, and also of journalists, podcasters like Joanny Sanchez and her Ventana 14 that is widely heard here in exile?
To such extent have been significant the internet and social media that I think without it, and it's not coincidence, we started having internet in Cuba for everyone in 2017. And I have said that this protest movement started in 2018. And it is no coincidence. There is no coincidence to that. Social media, it's like a coin, right, with two faces. In one, it can create networks. You can share ideas. You can share images, for example, of repression, and a text saying what happened, and then someone else can recognize that that happens in his neighborhood or her neighborhood, and then they feel not so much alone, and then someone propose a solution for that. For example, a police come to your door and say you're being summoned to go to a police station, and a citizen maybe is afraid and go, but then he reads on social media, or she reads on social media, that actually they can say no, because the policeman should bring a paper explaining exactly why, and there is a law for that, even though in Cuba the law is at the service of the Communist Party, but they could use that argument to say this needs to be signed by the attorney or the instructor penal. It has to have a seal, it has to have a date, it has to have a reason. Otherwise, I will say no, and you can't do anything. But then he or she finds out, they are not going to find that out on TV, right? They are not going to find that at school or university, no matter if they study to be a lawyer or anything like that. No one's going to tell them if a police coming out. They find about this on social media, because an activist actually do a post saying, a police came to my house and I said this. Don't be tricked. Do the same. You have the power of saying no. You have the power, which is something so important, so strong, and this is what you can do. So social media help with that. It also helped to spark the protest, July 11th. How did July 11th happen? 20 people did a broadcast video of them on Facebook at 10 a.m. and at 4 p.m. the whole country was on the street, because people in Palma Soriano, near Santiago de Cuba, watched that and said, oh my God, look, 30 people, they're saying freedom. Let's go out. This is our chance. And then Holguin, and then the whole country. But that is why when something like that happens, the regime shuts down the whole internet. And because this happens in Cuba all the time. Actually, when people are on their phones and there is a problem with the internet and they ask, oh, you don't have internet. It's a generalizing, oh, someone must be protesting somewhere and they don't want us to know. So internet and social media has been really a game changer for protest, but also they come with another side. the other side of the coin is they also are very useful for regimes to spread disinformation, polarization, hate speech, false news, and that creates mistrust among groups. This creates, confusion, and this weakens, right, our carving to truth, which is what this is about. So yeah, in a balance, I think when we become aware of those methods that can, that those bad use of the internet and social media, if we become aware of those, we can also have the tools to crack them and unravel them. I think they are more useful than, they can be more useful even with this than without them.
Carolina, your comment reminds me of our mutual friend, Farida Naburema, who many of you in the room know because she has taught 2 classes at Corbell for our graduate students over the years. But Farida was experiencing a similar thing in Togo with internet shutdowns. And this is, of course, a common tactic of dictators. And so, the shutdown of internets all over the globe is a pretty good sign that some sort of opposition is organizing and is getting strong. And we learned in a class she taught here that there was a really cool and creative tech development that happened in West Africa and was eventually used in the Gambia during the last major movement in the Gambia several years ago. And it was a mesh network that relied on radio frequencies or Bluetooth technology, something like that, instead of cell phone towers and the internet. And this group of activists were able to get this network off the ground and were able to mesh it so significantly that they could communicate and organize with each other in a really organized, compelling, and successful way when the country inevitably shut down the internet. And it was just such a good reminder, I think, of the importance of learning from each other, of learning from other contexts, and of thinking about, what these tech developments and technologies have multiple sides to them. And sometimes we have to anticipate the ways in which they can be used to undermine the goals of human rights and justice. Let's ask another question from the, yes, wonderful.
Carolina, mil gracias. Full disclosure, I'm Cuban. I have another fellow Cuban over here, Yvette. And we were on the island in November, and it was dramatically different pre-pandemic. We're also very involved in 2 national groups trying to make change in the island. So I have multiple questions, but one is, it's not only just shutting down the internet, it's los apagones. It's shutting down the electric grid. It's not just the internet, it's basically not having electricity for that's one of the things that we learned very quickly, which is you had to navigate your entire day around when the apagones were going to start because the entire electric grid would go down. So what do you think we can do? I mean, I think it's great, the dissidents, and I presume you're in touch with Junior Garcia, who I think is still in Madrid. I listened to his podcast when he first got out of the country. It was very moving as to what was happening. But other than being informed, Cubans can't own guns. Cubans can't have any of that. So when the military comes to play, they come to play with all the weapons, and the population has none because it's illegal for Cubans to own guns in the island. So how can we all help enforce and strengthen the freedom movement on the island?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for that comment. I was actually going to include that in my speech because it's very important to understand that Cuba is a country where civilians have no weapons. It's different, for example, than in Colombia. They even have a guerrilla armada. Cuban citizens, when a crackdown happens and the military come to shoot, they are shooting to unarmed citizens. No one but the military have weapons in Cuba. This is different than in Venezuela and Mexico and almost any other country. So when you see police violence in Cuba and military crackdowns, you are seeing military shooting and beating and using force against unarmed civilians. And this is something quite a special case, so thank you for saying that. How can we help? I think the best way we can help is to engage with dialogue with the Cuban people and the democratic movement, not with the Cuban regime. To listen to what the democratic forces want, what are their needs, but not the elite that runs the country and oppress its citizens. Leave them alone. They will always lie. They have already done these 64 years of oppression based on lies. But there are a whole citizens movement that wants to be, to raise their voice and to be listened. So engage with them, listen to them, to their needs, and what they really are asking for. The regime is weaker. If you give the regime oxygen, you will be playing alongside with him or with it.
What do you think it will take to release the 1,000 prisoners that are innocent people who got jailed because of freedom of expression? What do you think the U.S. government ought to do to try to put a lot of pressure on the Cuban government to release the political prisoners?
There is a lot of pressure from international community, not just the U.S., the European Union and other countries. Of course, there is never enough pressure on a thing like that. But the truth is, the Cuban regime will release these prisoners whenever it thinks it's good for them. Either they would have something in exchange, either they will think it's a good moment for releasing them, either the pressure is too high. That's why we cannot stop asking for the freedom of political prisoners. That has to be part of our everyday efforts. In Cuba, there are more than 1,000 political prisoners. Many of them are very young, even minors of age. There are also a lot of women, and the number is incredible. At the beginning, it was around 300, and now it's around 70, which is very high for Latin America. And maybe 70 is not much to you, but it is a lot. And these women, most of them have children, 5 children, like Lisandra Góngora. So they have children waiting for them, for their mothers, who are only in prison because they dare to go to the streets and shout freedom. So all of the stories, and each political prisoner, of course, is not a number, it's a person with a name, story, a fight. José Daniel Ferrer, who has been in prison for 3 times, he was a prisoner from the Black Spring in 2001, and now it's in his 3rd time, not 3rd year, 3rd time, and many others. So those stories count, and it's also very important when you talk about political prisoners to name them, to put face to them, to put face to their stories and their struggle, and to keep pushing. But I think there is nothing that the United States can do except of pushing and pushing, like the European Union does, or all countries. But the answer to that, it will be when the Cuban regime wants, or when it's convenient for them, as they have done in the past several times.
You've also been involved with some of the protests for their release in Miami, have you not been? Like, there's also been some international, I think, kind of, again, trying to, I mean, I don't think most people know that number of political prisoners have been thrown in jail over the past couple of years. That was a surprise to me, and I am a professor of human rights at this school, right? I think in some ways also just really raising awareness around this to find other strategies for demanding release is something that's really important.
We live in a world where political prisoners is a pandemic. You have in Egypt, I think I read, is 60,000. In Belarus, I think is around 30,000. Cuba is more than 1,000. We don't know exactly, but around 1,066 at least. It's more than that, but for a country with 10 million and some people, we don't know exactly how many people because of the last exodus, but around between 10 million and 11 million, this is very high. And also is very high for Latin America, that has also, you know, the Ortega dictatorship and the Venezuela dictatorship. Well, the Cuban amount of political prisoners surpassed that by 5 or 6 now. And that is also a proof that the protest movement is pretty much alive, otherwise they will not be in prison. So that only proof about the resistance of our country and our people. And the best thing we can do is actually to raise their voices, to amplify their stories, and not to normalize any regime, but especially the Cuban regime that has been normalized for a long time by many actors internationally.
Carolina, thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture and discussion. I'm particularly interested, just following on from what you were talking about a moment ago, about women and the high numbers of women that are being imprisoned. And I'm curious about how the regime uses gender to oppress, and particularly to focus on particular populations. I was really struck earlier when you talked about how a member of the regime came to you and told you to stay silent, and what the price would be if you didn't. Those mothers of the children who were being detained and imprisoned, the price that they would pay and that their children would pay. So I'm really curious to know more about, for example, how the regime is using sexist disinformation online and other forms to discredit women who are part of this movement and part of these protests.
Thank you for that question. I have suffered a lot of that targeting, gender targeting, especially online. The disinformation of women is the usual suspect. She is crazy, or she's drunk, or she's it's the usual suspects. But there is also another component on how they are targeted inside a regime like this. For example, when a woman is detained, this has happened to me, they ask you to take off your clothes. That doesn't happen to men. Only happens to women and to LGTB actually activists. And the reason for that is they want to humiliate you when you're naked, right? To men, they just do el cacheo. I don't know what would be the pat down. But to women, and if you say no, I did. I said no, just do the cacheo, and they could do things even worse. They could beat you, they will do it by force, but they will try to humiliate you using your body and to be naked in front of them as a way to actually be humiliated and then have second thoughts if you're going to keep doing what you do. So that is very specific, and it is for women. Also to mother. No, Marie knows about the story. When that happens, I'll share it. It's okay. It's a funny story. After actually that happened to me, I say no. They took my clothes by force and let me in a calabozo. You have all seen Chicago, maybe. You have seen the scene when they do a dance in the Las Rejas of the calabozo prison. Well, I did the same without my clothes. So the security agent came and said to me, "Are you not embarrassed?" And I said, "You don't humiliate me, you humiliate yourself. And just for you to know, when you put me in prison, I will be naked. So you will have a revolt inside prison." And they took me to house arrest very quickly after that. No, it's okay. Another thing they do to women, especially to mothers of political prisoners, is to threat them with their, if you, again, if you say something to press your son or your daughter, it will be worse for them. If you're a good mother, you will go silent. So they create this complex with the motherhood, and they will try to trick their minds. You don't go to protest, you don't go to the trial, and this is also something, a narrative very tailored for women specifically. But they have all kinds of techniques based on gender, based on sexual preference. But the state security of Cuba is the school of the Stasi, basically. No. So what they really want to destroy is your identity. They will find your weaknesses and they will go after that. And for that, they have different approaches, and for women especially. But despite all that, women, especially mothers, Cuban mothers, have been actually the true protagonist of all of this movement. That is the truth.
Thank you, Carolina. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about the mass exodus of people leaving. And my understanding is that many of them are the young, educated people who would be the ones who will be there to help lift the country up, hopefully. But there's the understandable tension of, your own personal one life. Are you going to try to stay there and fight, or go outside the country? And that's in a way also helpful to the regime, because anyone who's opposed to them then leaves. And then also the dynamic of, it's almost impossible to live in Cuba if you don't have family outside of Cuba who's helping you financially, and just the cycle of tension that's around this whole exodus. Do you stay? Do you fight? Do you go and then you can help your family from abroad? I think it's very complicated.
Yes. Actually, it's a very good argument for people that still justifies the Cuban regime and how good it is, healthcare, education, those beaches, the climate. Well, no one goes desperately crossing jungle and the ocean and risking their lives. Nobody escapes like that from paradise. If Cuba was the paradise that these sometimes people, the international left sometimes and when they defend and justify the Cuban regime, that's a very good excuse. If schools were so amazing and healthcare was, no one would in those numbers desperately escape, risking their lives, the lives of their babies, from a country just because it has economical, an embargo. No, because the rest is so good. And the numbers are so high, right? I think it's also a way of protesting, to escape. It serves the regime like a pressure valve, yes. But when the numbers are so big, it's also a way to exposing that there is something pretty much wrong with the regime. And at the end, in the longest term, to have a country with all of its youth out, the professionals, like you said, and everyone that actually just have made of old people, which is the case of Cuba. Right now, the largest population is people over 60. Almost no births, almost, and that will go against the regime itself. I have a feeling that if the regime would collapse, which is a possibility, and a potential transition to democracy happen, and it is a strong one, which is also a possibility, difficult one, but it's a possibility. I know for sure that lots of Cubans will return.
to the island and will be part of that growth, to which I hope human rights and democracy is in the center of it.
That's a wonderful question. As Carolina was answering, I was reminded that I think I cannot count how many events I've done from this stage in which the Warshonshire quote has popped up in my head, that nobody leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And it's just, I feel like this theme, right, it comes up over and over again in the human stories of people that make these really hard decisions. You miss your best friend terribly, right? There's so many things about leaving home that are so hard and so painful, right? And it's just, thanks for asking that really powerful question, I think. And thanks for that answer.
When we were in Cuba in 2017, the black market was very active. Is it still active, or has that kind of ceased?
Oh, the black market. I think, how bad, you ask? Oh, yes, pretty much active. In the black market inside, how does it work? I mean, there is a lot of scarcity in Cuba. You know, to buy food, to have very basic things that you need. Inflation, it's, skyrocketing. People do queue a lot to get, just bread. And sometimes they cannot even get that. So there is a whole industry parallel to the regime that tries to provide, of course, and to take advantage of the situation for the people that sells that, but also at the same time helps, other people to find so basic things that they would not have, in the legal and regular stores. So it's very much corrupted. Everything is under a regime like that. But it is part of the consequences of having an economy that is controlled completely and run by a totalitarian state, by the Communist Party, without being submitted to audience or checks or transparency or anything. They decide everything about your life, from what you eat, how you dress, because they control all aspects of life. So black market in that case, it's a bad solution, but it is a solution that communities find to try to balance that.
Thank you. We have time only for, I would say, a couple more questions. So what I'd like to do, if I can propose, let's take 3 at once and then let Carolina kind of answer them as a whole, just so we get a few more questions asked, if that works. Go ahead.
What is the most likely sequence of events that would lead to the collapse of the regime?
Great question. And then let's go over here. Where else do we see? Can we go in the corner over here? Any of my students want to ask a question? Kelsey, over there after this. And then maybe we'll take one more.
Hola Carolina, gracias. So my name is Michelle. I'm from Uruguay. And I wanted to ask you a bit about how I believe that, especially in Latin America, what's happening in Uruguay, in Cuba, has taken a partisan color, so people associated a lot with being against, with belonging to the political right, or being in favor to the left. Especially a lot of people, older people who have maybe inspired a lot of revolutions with what was happening in Cuba and still have a lot of scars from the past. So how can we dialogue with people who have such a polarized view of Cuba and maybe try and communicate sympathy with activists and make them look beyond right or left issue?
Thank you, Michelle. Let's go over here. Yeah, one here and then one there. And don't worry, I remember all the questions perfectly. So if I need to refresh, no, I'm just kidding. I go back to you.
Hi, Carolina. Thank you. I believe, and I've learned about this in my classes and everything, but how do you feel like the form in which history is documented um, through like a dominated male perspective? How has this affected your role as a female activist and overall the way that people perceive this movement, especially in Cuba, as such like a culture where machismo is very present?
Beautiful. Thank you. And last but not least,
I just wanted to know, you talked about Jose Marti and then that poetry inspires you. If you wanted to talk more about the poetry that inspires you as you're here today. That was it. Thanks.
thanks, Kelsey.
Okay. Well, your question is a question we all ask ourselves, right? How is the regime going to break down eventually? I read recently that in former Soviet Union, no one actually knew, even 3 months before the summer of '89, that that would happen. Actually, Václav Havel and others were interviewed or give declarations, or scholars in the United States or Europe, they had ideas that it would not be possible and it would take a long time, and it was a surprise what happened for many abroad, but even for activists inside those countries. 3 days the fall of the wall of Berlin, there were discussions in East Berlin, about this same question: this is not going to be possible, and it happened. I think the erosion of a regime happens slowly in time, and it's created by all types of gestures. Sometimes even a conversation in La Cola del Pan, right? Queuing for bread. Slowly by slowly, the erosion happens. And then that apparatus made by iron, that you never thought it could be broken, by erosion and oxidation, like the structures, the iron in the air, suddenly it collapses like un castillo de arena, right? Like sand castle. And there are signs for that. I think part of that is the lack of credibility when a regime, the morality of the regime itself, it's been cracked down, and I think that's happening. I mean, they don't believe in themselves anymore. You can see how they don't have solutions, and do you feel fear? Do you feel their fear? And it is very tangible. That is one of those signs that is happening. And also when people lose fear and they just understand what's really going on, and they are not fooled by the narrative of the regimes and the idea that the regime spreads. So those are signs. What could happen? I think I would want for a peaceful, massive demonstration like July 11th, and maybe for the regime to concede in start a process of negotiation with opposition. This is very important. It could be that the military did a crackdown. I would not like that. I don't think it will happen in the case of Cuba, because the truth is the military elite doesn't have as much power as we might think they have. The power is on Raúl Castro's families and the state security. The generals in Cuba, this is different. For example, in Venezuela, they have more power. The generals in Cuba are all, monitored. They have access to limited resources, although they have some, but it is not like they are so powerful, and they are being so controlled. Actually, after July 11th, 8 generals died suddenly in a matter of in a month time. Statistically, this is quite difficult to happen. So, but it could happen. A military coup could happen. I wish not for a solution, for that kind of solution. I wish, and I think Cuba regime is more similar to Eastern Europe regimes than, for example, Latin America dictatorships, for many reasons too. And I wish for a transition like the ones they had. I think that's the most likely scenario, and I hope for it. As the question of how can you explain, I say you have to bring this to a human level, which is actually where it is, to take that from a discussion, a political discussion, and to put it in human levels. For example, to the mothers of May, las Madres de Mayo, in Argentina. Now, they are very famous for opposing the military dictator in Argentina, for losing their children. And they don't want to know anything about the mothers of July, the Cuban mothers of July, right? Those mothers who have their sons in prison, and some of them who had lost their sons because Luis Laurencio Tejeda was killed in the back with a shot, with a gun, but in the back. He was not even, the police couldn't say he was defending himself. So you can say, you can ask to those mothers, why don't you go and talk to Yudinela Castro? Why don't you go and talk with the mothers of the Cubans in prison, political prisoners like your sons? Why don't you go to talk about your pain and listen to her pain? That's a good question for those who defend and justify us. And the other thing is, you know, a dictatorship is a dictatorship. Whether it is fascist, actually the Cuban dictatorship is a military one. Socialist, communist, whatever. It's a regime that oppresses people, period. It could be dressed on fascist clothes or communist clothes. But if you studied good enough, you would see that it is kind of una serpiente, a snake that bites its own cola, right? The extremes at the end are touch, this extreme touch, and the difference actually between those regimes are mostly external ones. In essence, the language of a state violence, which is what this is about, oppressing citizens, the language that violence have is pretty much the same. The other question. Bueno, the Cuban Revolution was made by guerrilla men, right? There was a lot of, to such extent, the machismo was there, that it was created for what they say, el hombre nuevo, the new man. To start, it was a man. That concept, you know, the new man that they were trying to build, el hombre nuevo, it was not women, it was men. Actually, women, if you see the images of women at the beginning of the revolution, they would be like men with the fusiles, with an arm, and you know, dressed in green. And they have been always play a secondary role supporting the men. Even Vilma Espín, Celia, all of them that were always in the back, never had really power, never hold power. You haven't seen never a strong woman. It's just as decoration, just to, you know, to say we have this. And the FMSF, for example, which is an organization of women created by the regime, it is used, for example, to repress women activists. I have seen women from the FMC, this organization, Federación Cubana de Mujeres, to beat on the street a las damas de blanco, which is an organization of mothers of political prisoners of the Black Spring 2001. So they have been even used as instrument to create violence against other women. So definitely there is a component of machismo in the regime itself. And actually that is why, in my opinion, the activism made by women inside the Cuban regime is so effective, because it's counteracting a nature of a regime which is machista. So it makes it more effective somehow when women oppose to a regime like this.
And very last, just maybe a 1-minute reflection is to the question of poetry. Can we end on the note that we began on in many ways about the
I
poetry
picked the poem
that's
that
driven?
day because I'm a huge fan of José Martí, basically. I had the book in my hand because the 27th of January is the day before his anniversary, 28 de enero, as all other people from Cuba here knows very well, the day he was born. And actually we were going to do something that was not a protest, was a celebration or an act, but then it turned into a protest. So I picked a poem that has resonated with me because it talks, it was written by Martí in exile in 84, while he was in New York. And it talks about this grief of having Cuba so close and so far away. And it compares it with the night. And in the poem, I would invite you to read it if you want, also talks about the universe and the relationship between men and the universe, and compares that sense of awe with the presence of Cuba in his life and in his in the map of his emotions. And I thought it could be a good one to be read in front of the Ministry of Culture. And so I did.
Carolina, thank you so much for being with us tonight. For being with us not only tonight, but also in residence for almost over 2 weeks, nearly 3 weeks. Carolina will be here at the University of Denver. She'll be speaking at Tara on Tuesday morning next week at 8 a.m., co-sponsored with World Denver. She'll also be guest lecturing in many of the classes of the students that are in the room. And so I just want to thank all of you for coming out tonight, for joining us, for being here, and for all of the wonderful human beings who've made this possible, both through the financial support of the programs that allow this type of work to happen at the University of Denver, as well as to all of you who just have logistically and energetically, looking at you, Shannon and Gergana, made this happen. So anyway, thank you again so much for being here, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.